Hello class, today we're going to talk about measurement and we are also going to discuss research questions and hypotheses. So in the previous lecture we learned about what is a concept and what is a social science concept. And so in this particular lecture we're going to learn how scholars go about measuring those concepts that they create. So let's first start with actually research questions. So a research question, it is a question. And most often you find the research questions or hypotheses typically right before the methods section. They could come earlier, but most often they're around that particular area. So if you're having trouble figuring out what the actual study is about, a good clue is to actually go to the research questions or hypotheses. That'll tell you what the focus was and actually what the concepts of interest were. So if you're trying to figure that out, that's a good place to start. So a research question is basically you're trying to explore. There's not a strong foundation of knowledge in relation to those particular concepts. So in qualitative, it can simply be to describe a behavior or pattern. It also can include the exploration of a particular concept. So let's say that you say that a concept exists, however, it's not well developed. Perhaps something like social media literacy. You say that this concept exists, but it's just still not well developed. So how would you go about, first of all, defining that particular concept? And then you could also get some feedback from participants about how they would assess whether someone is literate in social media or not. So it's a great tool when it comes to developing valid concepts. Ideally, you would start with qualitative research and then quantitative research if you're looking to develop a social science concept. And quantitative, this is the key thing, and it's often an error that people who are interested in research careers make. A research question involves, from a quantitative perspective, always involves two concepts or two variables. So you want to make sure that, let's say, you have an increase in one concept relates to a decrease in another concept. So you want to make sure, let's say, what would be an example hypothesis? So you could say an increase in anxiousness relates to a decrease in class performance, something like that. So you see that I have two concepts, and what I'm doing and what we are interested in quantitative research is predicting variations, but we want to identify the concepts that predict the greatest variation. So what our goal is to do is try to identify the things that are most useful for prediction, not things that really don't do much to explain another variable. So two concepts, remember that. So hypotheses can have a positive relationship, a negative relationship, or just simply a relationship. And it's more to it than that. But from simplicity's sake, a positive relationship would be an increase in variations related to the independent variable relates to an increase in variations in the dependent variable. So, for example, we could say self-efficacy positively relates to class performance. So an increase in self-efficacy relates to an increase in performance. And then as we did the last slide, it's a negative relationship. So an increase in one concept really relates to a decrease in the second concept. So we talked about maybe an increase in anxiety levels relate to a decrease in class performance. It's just an example. And then we also have just a basic relationship. So we can see kind of what that looks like. So again, we have two variables, and what we're essentially doing is predicting the relationship between those two particular variables. And this is what a positive relationship would look like with in output. And this is what a negative or an inverse relationship would look like. So that's how it's expressed graphically. A non-directional hypothesis typically looks at, we look at relationships, and we also look at differences. So we may simply want to know how two things differ or three things differ. And so what we might be interested in instead is in the differences between two or more groups. So we might be interested in, let's say we expose people to 3 experimental conditions. And we want to see if one particular condition has an impact on, let's say, perceptions of credibility or recall. So it could be, you could expose people to 3 different types of ads, one with a particular type of model, one with no model, and one with just text, something like that. And you could make a prediction that there would be significant differences among those 3 particular conditions, and that's why we would be interested in differences rather than necessarily a relationship. So here we have children of immigrants and children of native-born citizens differ in their job satisfaction. So that's a hypothesis. Now, is that directional or non-directional? And the same goes for college students who have firm career goals achieve higher GPA than those who do not have firm career goals. So the first one would be non-directional because there is no direction, and then the second one would be directional. So we have, what concepts do we have here? So the 2 major concepts that we have are firm career goals, and GPA. So basically people who have identified particular career goals are more likely to have better GPAs. Okay, so if we wanted to restate this into, so typically we see hypotheses when we have a solid foundation of knowledge to make our particular predictions, and we see research questions when the foundation is less strong. So think about that when you are writing up your manuscripts or your proposals. Should this be a research question or should this be a hypothesis? And your literature review will defend whether it should be a research question or whether it should be a hypothesis. If there's literature out there to support that particular relationship, then you may want to propose a hypothesis. So individuals who exercise regularly and individuals who do not exercise regularly differ in their confidence levels. So if we are going to make that into a research question instead of a hypothesis, it could be something like, how do individuals who exercise regularly and individuals who do not exercise regularly differ in their confidence levels? This is saying that we're not really sure how they differ, but it's worth exploring, where the hypothesis says we're pretty sure that this is going to have an impact on their confidence levels. So you can kind of see this is just an example of what we do in social science. Is we're kind of these mappers of chaos and mappers of reality, and all of that is expressed through social science concepts. So this is an example of a model and the various concepts and the various predictions. And so you can see one of the first things that I do with students is if they have ideas, I first have them list all the concepts associated with that particular idea. And then I ask them to map those concepts in relationship to one another. And so what they'll say is, okay, so airline image has a positive impact on perceived value. And so this person might have come to me about an idea about things that affect the airline's reputation. So that's kind of what I usually get is someone coming into my office. Well, I'm interested in ways to improve the airline's reputation. Okay, so then I start asking them to think of social science concepts to tap into that particular interest or tap into that particular topic. So I encourage you to do that when you're coming up with your ideas. Is you want to first kind of list some concepts and then map it out which studies make logical sense together. So you don't want to do something where, you know, if you're interested in the airline's image, you want all concepts related to the airline's images and rather than an outside concepts. Okay, so this is the definition of measurement. It was developed by Stevens in the 1950s. And so what he argued was that in the social science, we can measure things. And I really do like this particular definition. I can kind of go over some parts of this definition. So objects and events are measured, not magnitudes. And careful, deliberate observations of the real world, we are describing their events and objects. They are the most often described in terms of attributes. So we have objects. Let's say for an object would be a room, and events, rooms changing color, attributes of objects, the length of the particular room, attributes of events, times it takes to paint the room. So if we're interested in studying something, we want to first think about all the attributes of that particular topic and things that we can study in order to understand that topic more deeply. So it's really not he focuses on the objects, but it's really about the attributes of objects that are being measured. So think about what you're interested in and all the different things, the attributes of it that you could study to make it kind of interesting, things to explore and things that maybe people haven't really thought about exploring. And he said numerals, not numbers. So numerals can represent many different things. But it means that numerals can be assigned to anything. And so when we talk about nominal level of measurement, you'll understand what I mean by that. So he focuses on numerals rather than numbers. And then assignment and rules. So methods are the set of rules that you learn to study, and this is what we are learning in this particular class. And we're concerned with how we make decisions. How did we decide on our sample? How did we collect our sample? What did we decide to measure, and are those actual valid measures of what we're trying to measure? And so these are things that we think about a lot in social science. So it's really it's really fun. It's almost like a puzzle, but it's oftentimes you don't really get into it until you start really learning more about all these various rules and expectations associated with qualitative and quantitative research. But once you do, it actually is a lot of fun. Okay, so empiricism. We are making observations about reality, and we're saying empiricism, we really care about what do we observe, whom do we observe, how do we go about observing it, when's the best time to observe that, and then how do we analyze this data. So let's see, what could we do? We could do boredom in the classroom. So that's our concept. Our concept is classroom boredom, right? So now, how do you study that? How do you go about measuring that? What does it look like? And what are all the things that can affect my results? So we have to decide whom to observe. So when we study classroom boredom, we can't generalize to all people when we do our one little study. So we might do elementary students, we might do university students, we might focus on non-traditional students. And so your sample selection has to be defended. And why did you choose that? And why is it important? And then we have to defend how to observe this concept. So again, remember, we're focused on the concept. Now, how do we go about observing that? We could interview students. We could watch the students. We could do focus groups with the students. So there are different ways we could go about measuring classroom boredom. So the next thing is when to observe. So when's the best time for people to take a survey? So just think about yourself. You think better at certain times of the day. You may write better late at night or really early first thing in the morning. So, but do you think conducting a study on maybe a Friday afternoon would affect our overall results? So we have to think about all these things that play into human responses when we're dealing with humans. Now we have to think about how to analyze this data. How do we, translate to what extent are students experiencing classroom boredom? So we could look at the percentage participating in activities, and then we could also correlate classroom boredom with other variables as well. So that's kind of what empiricism is just breaking everything down and thinking about how to measure, all right? So operationalization. I actually have trouble saying this word. Okay. So conceptualization is the refinement and specification of abstract concepts. So essentially what this means is we pick a concept such as engagement. So how do we measure? We say engagement exists, but then we have to figure out how do we measure engagement. We have to develop rules for inclusion and exclusion, and we have to think about what's the best way, the best way to measure our concept. So it's always important, if you pick a concept, clearly use that same concept label throughout the paper, and then define what you mean by that concept, because you and I may differ as to what we mean by engagement. And then you have to defend which questions you use to measure engagement. And most often, and we're going to get into this, it's not simply one question. Remember, we are more interested most often in very abstract concepts in social science research. Things such as prejudice, things such as political engagement, things such as credibility are not one question concepts, okay? This is really important for you to understand. So, concepts as constructs. I think I threw that in there because I just want you to understand also is when you are trying to figure out how to measure your concepts, you have to defend the measures that you select. And one way to defend the measure you select is to look at to what extent other scholars use it. Because if other scholars are using it, there's kind of this agreement that this is a valid way to measure this particular concept. So you don't, I want to make this clear, you do not make up questions for your surveys or your questionnaires or for your content analysis. You want to first look to the literature to see what exists as to ways to measure that particular concept. If there's a scale that exists, you do not take parts of the scale and only use, let's say, if it's a 10-question scale that measures the concept credibility, you don't take off those questions that you don't think are interesting. You have to, first of all, ideally use the whole scale. And if you decide not to use parts, you have to defend why you did not use parts. And if you make up your own scale, a set of items to measure a particular concept, then you have to go through a long, lengthy process as to how to develop that particular scale. And I've taught scale development in the class. It's quite a huge process, and that's why people don't do it. This is why it's important to go to the methods section, go to the measures section, look to see which scales people use, and then you use those on your questionnaires, okay? All right, so operationalized choices. Oh, am I going the wrong way again? Okay, so let's start. So theories, we talked about theory. Theory is just a summary of our observations or predictions. And so you can see here, I have a topic, and then what I did was identify concepts that reflect that particular topic, and I made particular predictions. So in this particular theory, which is just the relationship between at least two concepts, reward affects people's motivation, which then ultimately affects people's performance. And so when you're writing a literature review, or any scholar that writes a literature review, most often you might address the topic a little bit, talk about the topic, but then most often you talk about that particular concept. Why are rewards so important? What is the impact of rewards? What type of rewards work better? And so just think about those when you identify a concept. Remember to look at the literature as to why this concept is important, how it's been defined, and defend why you think it's an important concept that will be a predictive utility in some sort of way. Holy slide. Okay, so there are two aspects of measurement that are particularly important. Often there's not a one-to-one relationship between the concept and the actual items used to measure that particular concept. So what you have to do is realize that a concept can be measured in many different ways. Many different ways. So if you do find a scale for one of your concepts, such as perhaps, I was trying to think what political engagement, I think, was one concept that was of interest. So let's say political engagement. You will find that many scholars measure it differently. And so you have to figure out which makes the most sense for you and then defend why you select that particular measurement. And most often, it's not a perfect measure, but it's the best that scholars could come up with at that particular time. And then there's direct measurement. So that's things weight, height, where indirect is motivation, knowledge, memory, satisfaction, organizational satisfaction, job satisfaction. Those are all indirect measures. Okay, so we have a variable. So a variable is one thing that you're going to study. You can look at many variables to represent some overall concept that you're studying. This is so hard to explain. It takes time. It takes a lot of time. So for example, I mentioned the concept of credibility, and specifically source credibility, which is very popular in journalism and mass communication literature. So source credibility has two concepts that reflect it, because credibility is a very much a multifaceted concept. And there's two things that scholars usually, there's more than two, by the way, but there's two concepts that people look at. So one is expertise. So there's an actual expertise scale. And then the other one, I believe, is trustworthiness. So the concept is credibility, but the culmination of two separate scales tap into credibility, okay? So just FYI, that you would have you would have basically two dimensions and then multiple, two variables or two dimensions. It's so complicated. Okay, so variables. When you select your major concepts of interest, what I expect is, this is what I expect, especially the major ones. And guess what? You might not find a conceptual definition for things such as expertise. They do exist, but what you'll find is oftentimes people don't define their concepts, what they mean by them. It's crazy. But anyway, so you need to define. So if you say, I'm going to select this concept, then define, tell me what you mean by that concept, okay? Don't assume that I know what you mean, okay? And then you want to operationally define that concept. And most often, you can defend the operational definition by selecting somebody else's scale. And conceptual fit just means that you have to argue that these items do measure that particular concept, and that's what's meant by conceptual fit. So theoreticians typically will go back and reflect to see if that truly is the best measures, or those are the best items to measure a concept. And Steve Chafee, the explication articles, is a great article about that. Okay, so operational definition. So it's the actual procedures used by the researcher to measure or manipulate that particular concept. So I like to think of an operational definition, which is different from the conceptual definition, as a recipe. So what are the ingredients that it takes to actually measure or create this particular concept? You have to select other scholars' measures most often, because the idea is that we're a community of scholars building knowledge. So if we want to see if our predictions hold with other samples, we can't really say that for sure if all the scholars out there are using different measures to measure the same concept. I mean, really think about it. We would not be able to advance knowledge if everyone just makes up their own measures for concepts. So this is why we use each other's concepts, because the idea is that, so let's say Joe tests one particular sample and Sam tests another sample, and we can see if those two concepts do relate between those two samples. Okay, so just think of it as a recipe, and you're putting this together, and you're making this this cake, I guess. I don't know. So latent or hidden variables is what we mostly deal with, especially on survey research. Is we're interested in things that we say exist but are difficult to observe. So let's say we can't really look at a person's bank account. So how could we identify one's income? So based on observation, if I was to look at somebody and let's say I could look at their handbag or look at their shoes or look at their car, I could make some assumptions about their income levels. Quality of life. We say quality of life exists, right? This is a concept that us scholars come up with. But how do we measure one's quality of life? Okay, so this is considered a latent variable. We have to come up with indicators that we say as a culmination that come together that measure quality of life. So that could be things such as, let's say, eating problems or quality of sleep. But it could deal with other things as well, such as air and water quality, pollutants, noise levels. So think about that when you're measuring variables. We have to figure out what observables we can use to measure these things that we say exist. So most often in survey research, we come up with what are called scales to measure these latent variables. So each observed item is one single question. And the culmination or all these questions put together represent that latent variable. So question 1, question 2, question 3, question 4. And we have to defend when we're making measures or creating measures that these 4 are the best representation of this latent variable or concept. So I'm giving you an example of this. So we have, this is a self-efficacy scale. This is made up, by the way. Even when things are tough, I can perform quite well. I will be able to successfully overcome many challenges. I don't achieve most goals that I have set for myself. I like ice cream. So, which of these don't really belong in this group of questions? Well, I like ice cream clearly does not really tap into the self-efficacy measure. The third item is what we do in survey research. You may come across this, is we have a negatively worded item. There's a lot of literature on to what extent we should be doing this. But so what we'll do is when we analyze the data, we'll reverse code that. So that we'll turn that into a positive thing. So the top 3 could be considered valid indicators measuring the overall concept of self-efficacy. But clearly, I like ice cream is not a valid indicator to measure self-efficacy. So what we're looking for when you are developing your questionnaires are scales. So a scale is a set of questions that combine together to represent this concept. Okay, so usually most scales should have a minimum of 3 questions or 3 items per dimension or per scale. I'll get into that a little bit, but essentially you need to have ideally 3 to 5. Sometimes they can go up to 60 questions. It really does vary. But I'll get into that. So why do we have at least, let's say, 3 questions to measure something? So we have the self-efficacy scale. So the idea is that single items should be measured with multiple items rather than just one item. And so you need to argue that this is evidence that the unobservable does exist. And what we do is we ask multiple questions. And if there's high intercorrelations among these items, one could argue that that particular concept does exist. So in order to make this happen, where 1 or 2 scale items are suspect and you can't really measure a lot of variance. So instead, we have to have at least a minimum of 3 questions per scale. So a third variable or question is needed because you're trying to capture the true central. You could use 2 items, but you should have, the ideal is around 4 to 6 items, but the recommended minimum is 3 items per dimension or per scale. So that's what we're trying to do in order to increase the accuracy of our evidence. So if you see people asking a lot of one-item questions on their survey, I would be suspect of the quality of information that they are getting from their survey. So we have things that are called indicators. The indicators are also referred to, I kind of go back and forth, an indicator or question. So remember, we could have a 3 question scale to tap into self-efficacy. So they're called indicators. But sometimes you find, as the example with quality of life, you have multiple dimensions to represent that concept. I gave the example of credibility. Credibility is not one scale, but 2 separate scales that measure credibility. There's an expertise scale and there's a trustworthiness scale. So those are referred to as dimensions. And so the expertise scale might have 5 questions and the trustworthiness scale might have 7, let's say, okay? So just know when you start looking at concepts, you might have a bunch of subscales or dimensions to represent a higher level concept, okay? So what I'm saying is concepts can be unidimensional or multidimensional, and so they can have multiple dimensions or just simply one. So this is an example here. Most scales that we develop usually have at least a few dimensions. Very rarely do you see scales with just one dimension, but it can happen. So if we look here, we have job satisfaction, and we have the scale of job satisfaction, and then we have subscales, and then we have employee engagement, and then we have 3 subscales to represent that particular concept. So you can kind of see this, and you'll see this in the literature. So I just kind of wanted to give you a heads up when you're reading and try to help you understand why that is the case. Negative items. So sometimes you have negatively worded items, like the self-efficacy example. I'm super confident, I feel confident when I do this, or I'm unsure how to go about doing this. And so when you basically go to analyze the data, you reverse code those. And you will sometimes see that as well. Some people say you should put negatively worded items in scales. A lot of times you'll see 1 or 2 negatively worded items on a scale. And the reason people do that is to prevent straight lining. So for instance, let's say someone just goes down the scale and answers all agree. And what a survey person can do is look, oh my goodness, this person straight lined this. And that's evidence when you have a negatively worded item in there that if they should have actually worded the opposite or marked the opposite way. So, but for the most part, scale methodologists argue you should do about 50% negative and 50% positive if you're planning to go about doing that, but you will find most cases that scholars don't do that. But there's a lot of great books out there about scale development best practices. Okay, so I talked about scale. Scales are used to measure latent variables, where indexes are almost the exact same thing as a scale, but it's used to measure manifest variables. So what this argues is that the culmination or the breadth of all the questions together represents a particular concept. So what you'll find is items on these particular indices don't often correlate with one another, but they do add up to the breadth of the behaviors related to the particular concept. So if we look at this here, This is a concept, political activism. So these might not highly correlate, but you could make an argument that each one of these, if a person does each one of these individual items, marks yes to it, that they are a very politically active person. I'm not going to go much into this because most often people don't understand the difference between index and scale. But if you want to learn more, please, holler at me and I'll be happy to help you understand, okay? But just know that if you're looking at an index, it's just the culmination of items do represent that particular concept, but the items might not intercorrelate with one another, okay? And I think that's all I have for today. Oh, wait. Nope, I got a few more. Okay. So, how do you decide which method of measurement is best? You just want to look at the reliabilities. If they have high reliabilities, I'm not going to go much into that. But if scholars, and it probably wouldn't get published with very low reliabilities, but if scholars are reporting below a 0.70 or a 0.80 reliability, depending on the method, it probably isn't a good measure. And if they aren't really great or useful at predicting variations in the other variable, and the other concept, is probably not a good concept. And I'm not going to go too much into validity, but validity just concerns the truth of the measurement. To what degree do these items as a collective truly represent that particular concept? So I want to encourage you to just take a close look at measures, because I don't think we do this enough. And just see and really think about, do these really do a good job at reflecting that overarching concept, okay? There are various modalities of measurement. For the most part, we're going to focus on self-report in this particular class, but there are others as well. Self-report measures. Basically, you're just asking participants to share their, behavior, their opinions, things like that. There's a lot of issues with self-report measures. Oftentimes participants may distort responses to create a better self-image or to please the experimenter or organization. The response can be heavily influenced by the wording of the question. So really think about the wording of the questions, and give feedback on your questionnaires, okay? All right. Of course, there's physiological measures, and we're doing this more and more now, and it's really kind of cool, but they're great for accurate, reliable, well-defined measures. Disadvantages is the equipment is usually really expensive or unavailable. And you have to know how to go about doing that. And so there's a lot of issues right now in research with other fields, especially in social science, taking these approaches. So for instance, like you could test people's reaction to television violence and test how they react to that, or images of morality or things like that. Okay, the last side. And then we have behaviors. So we could look at people's reaction time, reading time. I had one student, with her thesis, what she was interested in was how students search for information online about a science story topic. And so she actually recorded the keystrokes on their computers to look to see what sources they use to inform their stories. So there's a lot of behavioral measures out there, and you can also ask people behavioral questions as well. So just really think about the best behavioral measures and whether you are measuring actually behaviors. A lot of times people mix measures together, but I'm not going to get into that. But anyway, if you have questions or you want to know more or learn more, I'd be happy to talk about that as well. So I hope that you learned something from this particular lecture, and I will talk to you guys later. Bye.